major event every year. The second Sunday in October, the George Lyle Lecture. This lecture is named Memory Honor of George Lyle, outstanding Baptist, who started the Baptist work in Jamaica in the 18th century. A man from humble beginnings who had a vision and established so many churches, established schools, and was way ahead of his time in many firsts, and being the first Black man to start Baptist church in Jamaica, and some firsts also in the United States of America. But in the wisdom of the Jamaica Baptist Historical Society, the committee has decided to have this history forum. And we are delighted to have as our panelists, the Reverend Marvia Laws and Mr. Jeremy Taylor, both of whom are members of the Jamaica Baptist Historical Society. The Reverend Marvia Laws is a well-rounded person. She has had a life in academia. She has had a life as a talk show host, Love FM. She has had a life as a missionary to Panama. And she is serving as female pastor of the Sligoville Circuit of Baptist Churches.
Government employees in vaccine take-up. In an interview with Radio Jamaica News,
if you are not, please mute your mic. Those who are not speaking, please mute your mic.
That the unions have been encouraging the workers.
I saw a message from Candice. Yes, please mute your mics. I hope you heard what I said before. And Reverend Marvia Laws is well known for tackling difficult and controversial topics. Her postgraduate work was on the Native Baptists, and now this forum, she's going to talk about Obeah. The other panelists, Mr. Jeremy Christopher Taylor, QC, is a history buff. He's the chairman, he's our chairman of the Jamaica Baptist Historical Society. He's also a member of the Jamaica Historical Society. And if you want, he reads widely on historical subjects and knowledgeable on many. Jeremy is the Senior Deputy Director of Public Prosecutions. He is well known for a few cases, but his greatest accomplishment so far is being a graduate of the great Calabar High School. And shortly, they will be making their presentation. I know some of you are wondering why I have been asked to be the moderator. I think 3 reasons. One, I'm a member of the Jamaica Baptist Historical Society. 2, in my book, The Cross and the Machete, the Native Baptists of Jamaica, I've written fairly extensively on Obeah, what it is not. And I think the 3rd reason why I've been asked to be the moderator is that I was born in St. Thomas. We have an esteemed panel, experts on the subject of Obeah. And I now invite the Reverend Marvia Laws to make her presentation following which we'll have the presentation by Mr. Jeremy Taylor, and then we'll have questions and answers. You can also put your questions in the chat, which will be monitored by Sister Delia Campbell. Marvia?
Thank you so very much, Dr. Dick. Thank you for the gracious introduction. And I want to also extend welcome to all who are here with us this afternoon, sharing in this, our discussion. And I am particularly keen on getting to the discussion. I'll take just a few minutes to make an introduction. So please, I'm asking the audience to understand that we'll just be touching on some of the points that we do hope will spark your questions and comments through the moderator to us as we go forward. So first of all, I'm going to be talking about Obeah, just really what it is about. I'm going to be jumping to a quick look at the Act, the Obeah Act, to make some comments. The weight of the presentation on the legal aspect will certainly be on the expert, Mr. Jeremy Taylor. And then I will look at, just make present three items for consideration as we look at some of the broader implications and issues that over the years I have raised questions about, commented on, hold strong positions on. And in the end, I'll conclude with recommendations. So first of all, quickly, what is Obeah? I'm not offering a definition here. What I'm suggesting here are like three popular approaches that we would get. So there is one. If you ask the average person in the public, what is Obeah? You're going to get usually a one word. And the usual one word is black magic or witchcraft. Then you ask, what is black magic? And then you're going to get, something to do with demons and evil working, but really the average person does not have what we would consider to be a real definition for Obeah. And even scholars struggle to agree with what is Obeah, and our act says something entirely different, but quite specific in naming what it is. So popular responses: black magic, witchcraft, sorcery, working evil, working science. And notice I use seance and science. And of course, one would talk about a ritual for consulting with spirits or getting in touch with the invisible realm. And the other would be talking about science, which is really one way to classify the practice or the study of the mystical arts, to say that it is the work of science to prove that which you say you hold as a belief, etc. So that's what I mean when I put the slash for seance and science. And then, of course, evil working, demon or dopey business, or dopey something. Those are the common responses you'd find in the public. When you come from a religious phenomenon perspective, what you tend to get is I'm just offering a summary statement that it's speaking to a number of things, that there is a system, or it's a system of beliefs. So we're hearing about beliefs. We're hearing about practices, ritual practices, and these ritual practices, persons will go into that to speak to, maybe it is baths, the use of instruments, as the law says, the use of objects, the use of oils, the use of prayers, the use of psalms. And we had a very popular psalm. Psalm 35 is one that is well known. It's a warrior psalm in the realm of this religious practice. And then, of course, the origin. So where is this coming from? And it's often, you would hear the general categorization of African traditional religious perspective or religious expressions, specifically identified with the Efik people, the Igbo people, the Yoruba, and the Akan peoples. So you have a sense of the African Delta region, the Western African Sub-Saharan regions, as to where the origins would be, because just to say African traditional religious practice is quite broad, because the continent carries a multiplicity of religious expressions. And then there is the legal definition, and this is outlined in the Obeah Act. And here we have the first definition is that Obeah shall be deemed to be of one and the same meaning as nihilism. So this is quite specific, that it's talking about nihilism. Of course, the act does not then go on to offer a definition for nihilism. It tells you that it's automatically one and the same. And that, of course, presents a controversy at the outset, because for religious scholars, for those who understand religion, they're not the same. So that's a problem. And then, of course, it goes on to look at persons practicing Obeah and those who consult. It also speaks to the instruments or the objects that are used. And it also goes on to talk about the suppression of literature that is used in the consultation process. So overall, that's what I want to put out there in terms of the issues and the controversy surrounding a definition of Obeah. And the basic thing is the average person does not know what Obeah really is. So what we tend to do is go straight to the negativities that we have learned and we have been socialized to understand that this is evil practice. This is people working harmful things against others. It is about the occult. It is about criminals walking with them Bible to get protection, all kinds of things that you will hear. So I just present that quickly. After we look at the definition, I want to just look at three things for us to give some considerations to as it relates to today. And one of them is the racist origins of the Obeah Act. The second is the unconstitutionality of that act and its injustice against Africans. And the third, we want to talk about power or powers in contention. So the racist origins of the Obeah Act, we have heard a number of persons speak about that. And I just want to lift up two examples that we have seen in the public space. And we hear, for example, from Professor Diana Payton. She has spoken and written and researched extensively on this, and her work is easily available on the internet as well. You can go to certain sites like Histories of Obia or Obia Histories. You can get information about the cases that have been brought against Africans and descendants of Africans in the Caribbean, and also cases specific to Jamaica from her work. But she wrote in an article titled The Racist History of Jamaica's Obeah Act in the Sunday Gleaner of June 16, 2019, those who supported harsh Obeah laws, including many middle-class Jamaicans, intended that the law should intervene broadly in everyday cultural life to wean Jamaicans away from beliefs and practices understood as connected to Africa. So it is specifically targeting beliefs that are of African origins, and it's done in such a way. When you examine the history of the cases that have been brought against Africans, you begin to see that there is a specific thing. You can't hide the fact that it seems as though African religious expressions, beliefs, and practices, and it's not only that it seems, it is said that this is worse than any other kind of religious practices that you could ever think of, or that is being practiced today. And I'm going to look at that a little bit more. Another one is from then final year student Fitzroy Randall. He was doing his Bachelor of Arts in Communication, Media and Communications, and he wrote that the Obeah Act has nothing to do with witchcraft and everything to do with white supremacy. The Obeah Act is a discriminatory colonial anachronism that favors European belief systems above all others. And we will see evidence to support this in a little while. These two are just examples of opinions that are posited in the public space that tells us about the origins, where did this come from? And I'm pretty sure that when we hear from Mr. Taylor in a little while, we're going to get, the origins. Where was the first act, against Obeah or this practice come from? And we are going to be hearing a little bit about the Maroon War, or the one that is associated or affiliated with Taki in the 18th century. And from then, we can begin to see the progress over the years, that it was specifically targeting the Africans who, because they were turning to the Obeah men, consulting those who were called Obeah men and Obeah women, of course, naturally, for help, for courage, for protection as they mounted rebellion against the British troops and the British colonial system. So that's one thing that I want us to understand. We go on a little bit further to look at additional implications for this as we talk about the racist origins of the Obeah Act. Could I get the next slide, please? And we want to see a little bit more about its implications for the Baptists in particular. So I pinpoint the Baptists, and Dr. Dick did mention his own work in this area on the Native Baptists, and where we see in our own history in Jamaica and the Baptists in particular, a specific targeting. And if you remember in the definition that was given, what is Obeah? Specifically one and the same as nihilism. One of the things that we as Baptists can look back and find in our history, the majority of the African membership with retentions of African spiritualities was to be found among the Jamaica Baptists. And the Jamaica Baptists, as we would see in the research, will show that we have what we call the Native Baptists, with all of the question signs around that matter of nativism. Who are the Native Baptists who really can be so identified? You can get more of that in Dr. Dick's book, and of course you can find my work in any library. However, what I'm talking about specifically for us here is that you, in the Baptist church, you could find observed expressions of beliefs and practices that were labeled as Mayal or Obeah, Poco, Pocomania, Kumina, Revival, Zion. And this is not that you'll find them all at the same time, but when you look at the progression of history and the changing forms, the names and the labels would be appended over the course of the period of history. But specifically, Mayal, when you read certain accounts, you will hear about the 1860 and 1861 Great Awakenings, if you're reading it from the missionary literature of what took place in England and North America. But later on would happen in the Caribbean, would spread to the Caribbean region. And this would give rise to the Great Revival, and which of course has given rise to what we call revival bands. And you hear persons in Revival, Zion identifying themselves as either belonging to the 1860 band or the 1861 band. So this is all part of the history and the milieu at the time. So Mayal, you could say, was strongly identified with the Jamaica Baptists. It wasn't them alone, because when we had the Great Revival breaking out, so to speak, in Jamaica, this also happened in the Methodist Church and among the Moravians as well. But as I said, because of the majority African membership to be found among the Baptists, you will find that the Baptists were particularly targeted, and the persecution took place, the scrutinization of leadership in the Baptist Church, and of course, some of them were jailed as well. You will also find, coming out of that tradition, the presence of what we'll call the mothers and the leadresses in the Baptist churches, in the class houses, or the daddies, such as a daddy sharp, also part of the organization of the church. However, they were targeted because it was felt that they were facilitating and accommodating the planning and the execution of rebellions from these class houses. Another thing I believe that we see in how this was targeting the Black population, the African descendants, and the Baptists in a particular way, is that we also have among the Baptists internal tensions and splits. You will find even today that Baptists, as we are, we will not readily identify with, say, a Moses Baker, because Moses Baker's brand of being Baptist certainly reflected a lot of African retentions. When you look at practices like lying on the morning ground, dreams and visions, walking out into the woods to get visions, and this would determine whether or not you would become a member of the church. we still today distance ourselves from that so-called dark-looking, Obeah-looking, Maya-looking past because it sullies our reputation as being a serious Christian. Of course, that means the Europeanized version of Christianity as well. And you will find that this has informed how we continue to be church even today. And I'll say a little bit more as we go along. So that's the first observation. The racist connections. It is deliberately focusing and targeting on curtailing the African religious expressions and retentions to be found among the African descendants. The second thing I want us to consider has to do with the unconstitutionality of the Obeah Act. And in it, you see, when you look at the Obeah Act and you look at the Charter of Fundamental Rights and Freedoms of Jamaica, what you see are, I've highlighted just 4 things here that I feel are breached. 1, the freedom of religion, the freedom of expression, the freedom from discrimination on the grounds of, and I could highlight among the many things here, we see religion being one of those things that you're not free to give expression to. And also the right to seek, receive, distribute, or disseminate information, opinions, and ideas through any media, especially where the Act speaks to the suppression of any literature that seeks to promote or tell people about Obeah. And remember what the definition of Obeah is. So these, I believe, are examples right there in the Charter of Fundamental Rights and Freedoms where breaches occur. We continue with the presentation. The third one is the one that I want us to hear just how I've reflected on this. And this has to do with resistance and power, or powers in contention. So if you see religion as a cultural tool and that it gives or lends itself to spiritual expression, where we connect those who believe or give expression of faith, connect to that which is sacred and to our fellow humanity with the environment and just how all of that is brought together, where we share a common humanity. And where we see that that is being curtailed for a certain set of persons, then it is evidence of discrimination. And the discrimination I find interesting as it relates to 2 things, two spaces. 1, who gets to own, to authorize, and to deploy power or powers. And remember that I'm saying this in relation to the Obeah Act, or that which we called Obeah, and which has been negatively presented at all times as being evil practices. However, if we look at what it really is talking to, it's a broad brushing for the cultural religious retentions from the African space of the majority of us, our ancestors. And I'm not here romanticizing what comes out of Africa, neither am I saying that everything is so wonderful and good. I'm just simply saying that when the broad brush is applied, it also daubs in negative ways the good things as well. And this is what I want us to look at. So right now, and from historical times, what we have found is that there has been animosity against African practices that has been perpetuated, especially and particularly so through the colonial missionary theology and the established church. It has been presented as though we have to be at enmity with our ancestral roots and who we are. And there's been serious efforts to whitewash the African into being true Christians. And we see evidence of this. When you read the literature of how it has been viewed, or how the African has been viewed, or how our ancestors have been viewed, you see evidence of this as well. So the established Christian church, I want to challenge. And I want to speak even more personal to the Baptist space. For example, let me go back to the matter of the class houses. And quick 3 stories. 1, experiences which led to my immediate research when I left United Theological College of the West Indies because of experiences. 1, St. Catherine, where I originate, Linstead. And in that space, I grew up seeing that there were persons who were marginalized or pushed out because they professed a certain way of expressing their spirituality. So they were not oriented towards Pentecostalism in the popular sense of religious expression, but they would have prayer meetings. They would have in their houses, you could go and they would pray for you, and they might have anointing you with olive oil. And what I've seen is that what has emerged is this conflict between the center of who has authority to deploy healing. And this has led, I believe, to the impoverishment of our churches, because we don't have tolerance for those who manifest a certain kind of spirituality that seem to challenge the center, which is the clergy. The second thing I've observed, St. Thomas, another parish, where we have strong retentions as well, and Trelawney, another parish, and something critical, the class houses were feeders for membership in the large churches, and persons held dual membership in both spaces. And after a while, again, the conflicts that emerged with missionaries at first and then local leadership began to see the whittling away of those resources that we have in our churches. That today, what we are doing, to me, one, we have diminished the presence and the importance of the spiritual presence in our churches. And now we are fighting to appear Pentecostal and North American in our spirituality, to appear as though we are relevant. Those are things I want us to look at. Who gets to own and deploy power in our established churches? And if it isn't the pastor or the authorized leadership, any little man or little poor woman, so to speak, can't get up and decide that they're possessed by spirit and have visions and dreams or want to heal or so on. Problem is going to emerge in the church. Then there are the state-sponsored events. Let me just put a little question sign. What do you think we are doing when on National Heroes Day, for example, or Heritage Weekend, we go to lay wreaths at the shrines of our ancestors and our heroes who worked hard? So state-sponsored events are okay. And the shrine that is a national shrine is not really a shrine. But if somebody has a shrine in their house and call it a shrine, that is Obeah or malpractice. Let us talk a little bit about the recent passing of the former Prime Minister, Edward Seaga. State-sponsored 9-night. And what we saw was table set and invitation to all the known and recognized revival leaders and Zion leaders who under other circumstances would be vilified as workers of Obia. But this time they're okay. It's okay for us to have such a wake. Again, when state deploys the powers, it's not criminalized. But when the average person does it, it is criminalized. All right. The second thing I want to look at is the disempowerment and dispossession. And it is a separation that has been systematically done to separate Africans from their cultural heritage. And what I call the Obeatization and stigmatization that has redounded to our spiritual and material poverty. Talking about folk forms, the performing arts, and appropriations. Unless it is performed on stage and it's entertainment, we cannot embrace the power that resides in these expressions that we have inherited and the legacy that we have. And as a result of that, we have not been able to capitalize as a nation on that which comes out of us as indigenous forms, as created forms, because there is still the negative connotations, and we can only appreciate it and laugh at it when it is presented as entertainment. But then when a gospel artist, for example, wants to bust or get ratings, a gospel artist might just borrow from the revival space and play the drums and everything that sounds like revivalism. However, Sunday morning, we see him going to preach against it. Then we talk about ethnomedicine and healing. Within the space that is considered evil and the practitioners of Obeah, what we have, for example, is that we have been dispossessed of that knowledge that has been passed on from our ancestors to us of how we can use certain herbs and plants for healing. And yet we have been robbed of that because it is not authorized. However, when our scholars study these plants and then turn around and patent them and sell them back to us. It's okay because science has not ratified it. But when it's used in the space, instead of empowering our people to use this knowledge safely, we vilify it, and it is Obeah, it is bad, and it is wrong. It has separated us from the environment because we no longer appreciate the value of our environment, our sacred spaces, or have any kind of feeling that this is something that is good for us. Then there's the harmful stereotyping of people and places. St. Thomas, stereotype. What? Not St. Thomas. Can anything good come out of St. Thomas? No. Devon, no. Obeah, yes. Can anything good come out of Haiti, for example? We are going to be marking the official date of the Haitian Revolution. And I want to just pause and remember our brothers and sisters in Haiti. And the hurt that I personally feel when I hear Christians get up and say that what is happening to Haiti is justified because they practice so much voodoo and Obeah, and that is the heritage and is it they're paying for. As if we don't have our evils and so-called practices here in Jamaica that we need to pay for as well. Underground mutations that has given rise to fear-mongering and a lot of psychospiritual harm. That even if you should sprinkle baby powder, talc, at your doorway and somebody see that white powder, they swear that is something that is done because of the fear that is perpetuated to keep people away from this. And finally, the underworlds and the occult and magic is an ancient relationship. It is not only unique to Africa. And so when I see, for example, the act that speaks of nihilism and it speaks of anything that speaks of occult or esoteric practices, I want to ask, what do you think the so-called Hindu astrologers are doing? What are some of the things that are reputed to happen in secret societies? What are some of the things that happen with persons in spaces where they engage in outright occult practices? And why is this only labeled as nihilism? I really believe I want to throw those things out for us to consider as we think about the powers and power in contention today. So what is my conclusion? My conclusion is that the act should be repealed. I believe that we should begin the process seriously. That has the opportunity that has been given to us to decolonize not only the many artifacts and all the teachings and ideas in our society, that we see this uprising of the so-called hashtag Black Lives Matter, but right here, we need to begin to decolonize our African spiritualities, religious beliefs and practices, and look again for ourselves at the things that are good that we are throwing out with the bathwater. And I believe that we need to reclaim our spiritual heritage for our empowerment and the betterment of our people. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Reverend Marvia, for that powerful presentation. It was a profound presentation and had practical suggestions, and we want to really thank you. I see that your pastor is online, Reverend Everton Jackson, and I know he'll be proud of you and that powerful, profound, and practical presentation. And there are many other persons while you were talking in the chat room, they're saying amen, amen, amen. Now we're going to go to Mr. Jeremy Taylor, QC, the chairman of the Jamaica Baptist Historical Society, to make his presentation. And then we'll open for questions and we'll get the answers.
Thank you very much. Boy, Reverend Laws is a hard act to follow, but I hope you will still pay attention to what I have to say. Now, before I begin, let me just give some disclaimers, like every good lawyer. All opinions expressed here are my personal opinions. They are not the opinions of the Director of Public Prosecutions. They are not the collective opinion of the Jamaica Baptist Historical Society. And neither are they the collective opinion of the Jamaica Baptist Union. The second disclaimer I will give is that I am not a practitioner of Obeah. But at the end of this forum, at least in relation to my part of the presentation, I want you as citizens of Jamaica to determine where, even if you are against the practice of Obeah, whether or not we should continue to keep this law. And I want to start out by pointing out that, well, let me point out with an incident. When I was a boy, some point in the 1970s, I am old enough to be aware that there was a coffin on 3 wheels traveling about, at least in the parish in which I live, the length and breadth of Kingston, with 3 drunk pallbearers asking for, depending on who tells you, asking for Mr. Brown or Mr. Smith. Can't find anybody who said that them actually see this coffin, you know, but it caused great consternation, and crowds and traffic did pile up, and everybody was running to go see this coffin. And what does that actually tell us? It actually tells us that reality in places like Jamaica is not only a scientific reality based on things like 5G and computers and science and so on, but that the supernatural and the magic are just as much a part of our everyday lived reality. So there is a sense in which we really don't conform to Western notions as to how we live our lives and how we perceive realities and so on. Can you go to the next slide in the meantime? So what I want to show in this by part of the presentation is that Obeah is still with us. It is still a talking point. It is still an issue. So I want to point out, you may have remembered this headline in the Sunday Observer of July 4. Under fire, chairman of a primary school board in St. Thomas declared he's no Obeah man because apparently there's a move afoot to get him from being the chairman because they say that he practices Obeah. The next slide, please. The next slide is actually taken from the Star. And this is a woman who in Montego Bay left what was called a candle shop. I didn't know that you had these kind of things, but persons from Obeah who are in this presentation may even know the shop that this is being spoken about. And police officer, who I may suspect perhaps had a reasonable cause for suspicion based on the shop she was coming from, searched her bag, found these articles, these oils and so on, and detained her, warning her she was going to be charged for Obeah. So this was in June 29th. So in this day and age, the enforcement of the law is haphazard, but you can still be arrested. Of course, nowhere does it mention that the owner of the candle shop was arrested also, just the customer. Next slide. So what we have in Jamaica is a clear division. There is a cultural tension about Obeah, where we try to see ourselves as Western and civilized versus seeing that all that is African is barbaric and savage and a primitive past. Next slide, please. It also affects us in law, whether or not these laws that predate independence should be kept. And I try to illustrate that divide. So, taken from the Gleaner, we have the Attorney General of Jamaica stating that the Obeah Act should be kept. Why? Because Obeah has always been known to be a tool of the darkest form of evil that does nothing but harm to others. You see, when you do the studies, it's not exactly true. Not all Obeah is evil. You do have evil practitioners of Obeah, but not all Obeah is evil. They use it for healing. People use it to find love. People use it to get jobs, but not all Obeah, the practice is evil. Then you have Reverend Merrick Miller, known popularly as Al. And I'm going to quote what he says, why the law should be kept. We may need to amend the law to current relevance, but not to remove it. To decriminalize will send the message that we sanction the malicious and evil intentions of those that use Obeah to harm others. Should a government choose to sanction action that deems or intends to cause harm, injury, or death to citizens? A question that we all have to grapple with. So these are persons who are saying we must keep the act. So no less a higher personage than the government's lawyer, the Attorney General, and the well-known clergyman, Reverend Al Miller. But then there is the other side. Let us go to the other side. Former Justice Minister and Attorney General of Jamaica, has come out, Mr. Oswald Harding QC, has come out in favor of repealing the law. I continue to worry about these modern dark ages that continue in the thinking of our leadership and society in general. The Obeah Act has outlived its useful life. I remember, I said at the end of this forum, it is going to be a matter for you to decide whether or not this law should continue to be on the law books. And people may think that, boy, because he is not taken very seriously, we perhaps should not deal with this opinion seriously. But L.A. Lewis has come out in favor of repealing the Obeah Act. And the other person, next slide, please, that has also come out in favor of repealing the Obeah Act is our own moderator, the Reverend Devon Dick, former president of the Jamaica Baptist Union, pastor of the Boulevard Baptist Church. And he in his article, and remember in June 2019 was when the Minister of Justice floated the idea of repealing the Obeah Act. And the Reverend Dick said, I'm going to quote him in whole: possession of oils, incense, and magic spray ought not to be a crime and would appear to be unconstitutional. To criminalize a belief system is patently unconstitutional. The Chief Justice Brian Sykes, Justice Batts, and Justice Palmer Hamilton have already stated in this case that Jamaica is under a new paradigm since the passing of the Charter of Fundamental Rights and Freedoms. Under that charter, everyone has a right to religious freedom. It is just a matter of time before the Obeah Act of 1898 be declared unconstitutional. Strong words from a former pastor of the Jamaica Baptist Union. But what I try to do is articulate the divide in the society. So not all religious leaders, as you can see, are at Eden, are at one with it. Not all political leaders are at one. Not all entertainment figures are at one. So I want to know now, going to how did we get here? How did the Obeah Act come to be the law in Jamaica? So in my little research, I have constructed a timeline. When I'm going into this timeline, the first thing that my research comes out, and it echoes something that Reverend Laws has said, is that when the Obeah Acts were passed, they had nothing to do with strengthening the position of Christianity in Jamaica. They had nothing to do with punishing satanic forces in Jamaica. Because before the Obeah Act was passed, and I wish to say this emphatically, slave masters did not care about the religion of enslaved persons. They did not. It's only after 1760 they did. Why is that? Well, in the early days of British colonization, the law was still influenced by Christian principles. So the law was you really ought to evangelize these enslaved persons. But if you baptize them, you were under an obligation to set them free. So accordingly, slave masters became very hostile to evangelism among the slaves, refused to baptize slaves, were hostile to any ministry to the slaves for fear they would lose their workforce. It reached such a stage that Anglican Church, the Bishop of London, who had the superintendency over all the Anglican churches in the region, had to issue a declaration that baptism does not mean that you can't continue to exercise chattel dominion over your slave. And then it reached the stage where both the Solicitor General and Attorney General of England issued what was called the York Talbot opinion, where they said that baptism does not make a person free. So we need to remember that slave society in Jamaica was anti-Christian and anti-evangelism to enslaved persons. And in fact, if you look at the historical literature, Obeah is not mentioned until after 1760. People hardly wrote about it. People hardly cared about the religious lives of the slaves. People didn't care about the religious practices. And remember, this is a time in which the majority of enslaved persons in Jamaica were not born here. All came from abroad. So you had this mixing of different cultures, different religious styles, different religious beliefs, all put together in one big melting pot. I want to start off, if you look at this timeline, I start off with 1735, the Witchcraft Act. Why do I start with that? Because this reflects a tendency where sometimes the colonial power disposes and has moved ahead with certain practices, but we take it on in the colonies and hold on to it mightily. So in 1735, the British decriminalized witchcraft in England. In fact, they even made it a crime for you to accuse somebody of practicing witchcraft. So this is what is happening in England. Not happening in the colonies, but England decided, you know, this thing about witch trials and burning witches at the stakes and hanging them and so on, it has to come to an end. So the English dispensed with it. In 1760, after Tacky's rebellion, which, by the way, the Maroons, by way of treaty obligation, came out and helped. I shall just throw that into the mix. After 1760, the Jamaican Assembly, and this is a short title of the Act to remedy the evils arising from the irregular assemblies of slaves. So this is the first legislation in Jamaica. It's the first law in Jamaica that makes Obeah a crime. And one of the provisions states, any Negro or other slave who shall pretend to any supernatural power and be detected in making use of any blood, feathers, parrot beaks, dog teeth, alligator teeth, broken bottle, grave dirt, I suspect it's what they call duppy dust, rum, eggshells, or any other materials relative to the practice of Obeah or witchcraft in order to delude and impose on the minds of others could be subject to death or transportation. You know what transportation meant? You were taken to another Caribbean territory or elsewhere. So it's kind of something like what the British do with Windrush, and kind of like what they are doing, taking their prisoners, putting them on a plane and sending them back to Jamaica. And so over the years, they amended this law. The next slide, please. So over the years, they amended this law, experimenting with the punishments and so on. So the first act that addressed Obeah by itself, the first legislation dedicated to Obeah was actually passed in 1856. An act for the most effectual punishment of persons convicted of dealing in and practicing Obeah and nihilism. Now, if you look on that timeline, just above that is 1840. Why do I mention that? 1840 marked the beginning of some of the rollbacks of freedom in emancipation. So when the Emancipation Act was passed, flogging had been abolished. But by 1840, 2 years after the end of full free, the Jamaican Assembly brought it back. And flogging as a punishment was to stay on the law books of Jamaica until 2013. So it took 173 years before we managed to finally abolish this punishment. So 1856, you have the first act dedicated to Obeah. 1857, in case people didn't understand it, you had another act to explain what the 1856 Act was saying. Next slide, please. And then when we come down to the 20th century, so 1898 is when the present Obeah Act, the present Obeah Act that is the law of Jamaica, was passed in 1898. And then now you have other laws. So in 1940, a law passed during World War II to stop, supposedly, to stop Nazi publications and Nazi propaganda from being circulated in Jamaica. And this is a law under which Roger Mays was locked up for daring to criticize Winston Churchill in World War II with his with his article in Public Opinion, Now We Know. And then that law led to the order, the Prohibited Publications order. So it was under this act that things like communist and socialist literature was banned from bringing in Jamaica, Black Power literature, and also literature dealing with witchcraft. So anything published by the DeLawrence Company in Chicago, and you hear people talk about DeLawrence, it's actually a publishing company of occult material in the United States. Anything in relation to it was banned from bringing to the country. And I want to point to another watershed, 1993. The Vagrancy Act was repealed. So Prime Minister Patterson repealed the Vagrancy Act because it was an act which could see the police arrest you and charge you for loitering at night. So you are sitting on a wall corner at night with your brethren, them or talk at night, and the police will come and arrest you for vagrancy, put you before a court, and you could be convicted. But with the repeal of that act was also the repeal of the laws against witchcraft, dopey catching, fortune telling, and palm reading. So here we have the reason why Indian astrologers have a space to operate in this country, while the homegrown practitioners of Obeah have to be avoiding police. And then in 2013, the Obeah Act was amended to remove flogging as a punishment. So that's just a brief timeline of how and where we are and the history of it. So if you go back to when the Obeah Act was passed, you now have a situation where, by the time of the passage of the Obeah Act in 1760, going all the way down to emancipation, you couldn't practice your native religions, but you were also persecuted if you subscribe to Methodism, Baptists, or Congregationalists, or so on, or Moravianism. So you couldn't be evangelized and you couldn't practice your own religion. So when people say that the Obeah Act does something good, it does not. It was an instrument of oppression. And here is a table. Here's a table comparing Jamaica and Trinidad court cases for 50 years, 1890 to 1939. Go back to the table. And you can see for those 50 years, I'm sorry, looks like the presentation has winked out. For those 50 years, over 813 persons were brought before the courts over a period of 50 years for varying aspects of breaches of the Obeah Act. Now, my presentation goes on a little bit more, but I am going to stop here, and the rest of my presentation I will deal with in the question and answer session.
Thank you, Jeremy, for that wonderful presentation. I had a good fortune to see the full presentation. Not so sure why he cut it short, but I suppose it will come out in the question and answer session. And I noticed his disclaimer of not being a practitioner of Obeah, but I didn't even know that there was a thing called dopey dust. So obviously he's very knowledgeable on things related to Obeah. Okay, it's now open for questions. We ask that we have 490 persons on Zoom, not to mention those on YouTube. So to allow more persons to ask questions, just make the questions concise. It doesn't have to be a statement. So question time. I'll start with the first question that I saw in the chat. That one would go to Marvia Laws, Reverend Marvia Laws. They are asking you, what does the Bible say about Obeah? And then other persons can just show your hand and I'll acknowledge you.
Thank you so much for that question. What does the Bible say about Obeah? First of all, we are here I wonder if the person who's asked the question has accepted what we have said about the idea of Obeah as a religious belief, or Obeah as it is described in the legal act. What definition are they using? Where are they coming from with the understanding of Obeah? But if we're talking about the popular understanding, which is deemed to be its evil practice, it's witchcraft, it is black magic, it is that, then how do we respond to that?
Reverend Marvin?
Yes, you're hearing me?
Yeah, two persons asked the question, and they thought that it was an excellent presentation, and that you dealt with the socio-cultural and other aspects very well, but I just wanted to know what was the Bible's perspective on the issue.
All right, so my response again, continuing with one, the definition of Obeah that they're working with. And if it is that they are expecting to hear that the Bible says something about Obeah, Obeah is not in the word Obeah won't be found in the Bible. But if they're working with the idea of black magic, witchcraft as being Obeah, or among practices to be found in the spectrum of what we call the African religious expressions, then if I'm going to be quoting or citing the Bible in that regard, then I would say that one, fundamentally, as a principle, if we are taking the Bible, because I'm not going to be quoting any verses or drawing for any verses out of my head now and be accused of any proof texting or taking things out of context. But as a principle, we hold the Bible to uphold policies, principles, values, teachings, doctrines, and beliefs that promote that which is good, that which is loving, that which demonstrates the core of love of neighbor. And in that case, anything that is harmful or tears down or destroys or any of that which is not good, then clearly our teachings from the Bible would speak against that. However, I am saying, and I've made that very clear from the outset, that what we consider and what we have used Obeah to encapsulate is not correct. We have used Obeah to encapsulate all of the African religious practices and teachings and beliefs. And I'm saying that that is wrong, because the African religious teachings and beliefs that we have inherited comes a mixed package. There is good to be found. And in fact, if you go back to looking at, say, some of the African spiritualities that speak about the community, it speaks about the positive nature of that which we have inherited, but we are not taught that formally. One, the well-being of community. It talks about the well-being of the individual within the community. It talks about the promotion of healing, the promotion of harmony. There is nothing, I believe, that the Bible could speak against that. But the other side, where we want to talk about good Obeah and bad Obeah. And in fact, I can mention the tension that we have historically, where it is said there was this historical tension that the Obeah was the bad practice and Mayal was the good practice. Of course, such distinctions cannot be made in a clean way. So I'm saying that if you're asking me about the Bible condemns, and I preach from the Bible that which condemns harm, hate, anything like that. And that would mean not just Obeah, but things that are to be found in every single religion. The Bible would speak against those as well.
Thank you very much. I see a comment here where they said that excellent presentation. This forum should go live on both television stations. Delia, is there a question? Delia?
Yes,
Campbell?
there is. From Mr. Bertram Gale. He said, great presentation, Rev. Some more concrete suggestions would be helpful. What does the decolonizing or reclaiming process look like? That's for Rev.
And
what does the decolonizing or reclaiming process look like?
And QC, there's one I think here for you to think about. So if Obeah is legalized and someone tells you that they're going to Obeah you, that means nothing can be done about it. If that is so, should you be held accountable for some form of retaliation? But we start with the first question, and then we go to that one for Mr. Taylor.
All right. So the decolonization process, I believe, has to begin with a look back at our history. So we're first and foremost engaging in this conversation from a Christian perspective, that we have been Christianized, and that is the established religion that is our cultural ethos and identity in the region and in Jamaica in particular. However, we have to look back at how we have received, how that religion was transmitted to us. And some basic things. Let me start with what has become the Christian teachings and the influence of Bible and the interpretation of scripture comes from a place where certain beliefs have been fossilized, meaning that they're set in stone, the way how we have received them. And those carry a Hebraic, Hebrew, or Judeo, Greco-Roman, as in it reflects the Hebrew world, the Greek world, and the Roman world. And of course, later on, the strong emphasis of British teachings, ideas, and so on. And in that, you could perhaps begin with the premise of everything out of Africa, no good. Black Africa, dark Africa. So the way we have been Christianized is a place for us to begin. We have this teaching that everything was so dark on the continent that we had to go and bring the people out of Africa so that they could now become saved. It does not begin at a correct place. So the decolonizing process takes us back to an understanding of the continent, understanding our heritage, who we are as a Black people, who we are as Africans, the descendants of Africans, and what are some of the assumptions that are made that are real misconceptions and perpetuated lies. So for example, that Europeans were the ones who were civilized and Africans were not civilized. If you do your own research, you can find that that's not true. So the way we have been criticized, we have been Christianized and still remains today is seriously harsh, very, very harsh. We have received, as we say in Jamaica, a strong kind of Christianity because so much sin has to be washed out of us. But yet, it's assumed that the place from which the white missionaries have come is so pure and they have come with an advantage over us. So we have to begin to look back, one, at our history, that if we see that these interpretations have come and set in stone, we need to look back at where we're coming from and look at what we bring, what we came with, and the things that we have received and see whether or not they are serving us well. And if they have served us good or bad, and how we can correct some of those teachings that we have. So for example, and we don't have to get fairy tale about certain things. For example, drumming. I mean, just a simple thing like drums and the use of drums in our churches. How long it took, and I can recall even in my growing up, the 80s to the early 90s was when the drums, the Congo drums, became popular in our liturgy, in our music in church. And what was the response? At first, there were sessions and warnings about the use of drums. We must be careful about the kinds of spirits we are invoking in our church. And then somebody like one of these gospel artists who made the Congo drums popular. And suddenly the contemporary worship scene from North America was re-imported into our culture. And now we were now Christians singing beautiful music. I'm saying that that's one place we can look, our liturgy, our forms, our worship forms and our styles and so on. It's not okay until it travels to Europe and North America and re-imported to us. And if we would just only look for ourselves to where we come from and our own things that we have inherited and begin to critique those teachings that tell us that this is wrong, that it is evil. We can do that for ourselves. So that's a place I believe we could start.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So Taylor, you want to take that question from Nigel
Yes,
Walters?
and I think that question is a perfect segue into the second part of my presentation that I was going to go into. When somebody says they are going to Obeah you, what does that mean? What is legally? What is Obeah? This is a problem. This is the problem with the law. I don't know if the administrators can bring up my presentation. This is the problem with the law. The law does not define what Obeah is. And as a criminal practitioner and as a prosecutor, so I am the one who is going to go into court, or my agent, and lead the evidence against you. What is it I am leading against you? So the question is, the person said I'm going to Obeah me. What is he going to do? The law suffers from vagueness. Reverend Laws mentioned it, and it's also there, those hasn't come up back, but it's also there in my presentation. The law suffers from vagueness. It is not defined. Section 2 says Obeah means the same thing as Mayal. When you look in the rest of the act, Mayal is not defined. Now, every criminal offense has what are called certain elements. Murder is the killing of someone with malice aforethought, meaning that you went ahead, that you purpose in your heart, you're going to kill the person, and you did it. You had a guilty intention. Rape is having sexual intercourse without the person's consent. Larceny or thieving or theft is taking away the property of another with intent to permanently deprive. But Obeah does not say what it is. And here is the danger. How then is the citizen to know if he's committing a crime? Suppose I am a law-abiding citizen. How do I know that I'm not committing a crime? If by certain practices. Let me give an example how it could be done. Say that I'm in the history department of the University of the West Indies. And say that I am studying and I am an archaeologist. And I go on these digs and so on. And I have these skulls and bones in my house. Somebody comes into my house and sees them and calls the police. The police come and arrest me and say that I am in possession of instruments of Obeah. Again, that is not properly defined. How do I defend against that charge? How do I defend against that charge? And the way how the law was drawn was to make it easy to arrest, charge, prosecute, and convict persons. This act does not have any defenses like many others might have. So it doesn't have a defense of, well, if I'm an academic or a researcher or so on, I can have these things in my possession. It doesn't have a defense to say, I must know that I know that these things are instruments of Obeah. It has nothing. So it is a law which is overbroad and it is vague. And it's only a law that exists because the savings law clause of the Constitution preserves all these pre-independence laws. This law could not be drafted, as Reverend Dick would have pointed out, could not be drafted in Jamaica under the Charter of Rights. It is an oppressive law. It is a law that is vague. It is a law that is uncertain. And so in relation to the question, somebody tells me I'm going to Obeah, I really don't know what it is. If the police come to me as a prosecutor, police gets that report and say, Mr. Taylor, man saying we're Obeah you, what I must do? So what would I tell the police officer? Tell the police officer, you can't charge a man. What are the elements of Obeah? So Obeah is one of these things where you can't define it, but supposedly you can say what it looks like. That might operate in other spheres of life, but it cannot operate in the criminal law where there is a presumption of innocence. So I hope I've managed to answer that question.
Thank you very much. Delia, is there another question in the chat room?
There isn't a question, but Winsome Crombie saying, Jeremy, you mentioned lots of things to be dealt with regarding the practice of Obeah in Jamaica. For example, other countries can practice their Obeah here in Jamaica, and our own people are locked up by the police for the same thing. And Norman Ramsey, has anyone been convicted of Obeah in Jamaica?
Yes, but not in recent times. So the last case that I know about in which the police were actively enforcing Obeah is a decision that went to the Court of Appeal in 1966. Now, we really don't collect great statistics from the resident magistrates or parish courts, but I quite suspect it is a law in which the police are not actively enforcing because they have much more on their plate. All these gun crimes, gangs, murders, and so on, they really don't have the time to go and deal with Obeah. So the cases where we see Obeah coming are usually sexual offense cases, either rape or procuration by fraudulent means, procuring sexual intercourse by fraudulent means. So these are the kinds of cases in which we see an Obeah dimension, but we are not seeing many cases being brought by the police before the courts.
Okay, I see questions from, well, a comment. Josel Needham wants to make a comment. There's a question from Dr. Anna Perkins, and Reverend Anton Jackson has a question too. So let's take the comment first from Josel Needham, and then we take the other two questions. Okay, while we are waiting for that, so Taylor, something was happening in 1760 while the act came into being. the tacky thing. Was anything happening in 1898 while there was this amendment?
What was happening? So 1760 was because of the Tacky Revolt. But for some reason, after, I'm trying to put it within a context. So after emancipation, between emancipation and the rebellion, there was this move towards Christianizing Jamaica. So you got a lot of pamphlets and books being written by missionaries, letters to the editor, talking about the depraved and debased status of Jamaican people, about how they needed to be elevated, how things like Obeah and so on are reasons that are holding them back, why the colony can't advance. And so it is for this reason, it's my reasoning, why the law was preserved. The punishments were reduced, but the law was kept. So it was this move in that sense to rescue the cultural and spiritual soul of Black Jamaican people as to why the law was preserved in 1898 and continued to be reenacted. But remember, it was still reenacted with flogging. So flogging was still a punishment. And even though flogging had not been imposed in Jamaica since the late 1960s, it still remained on the books. So it still remained a punishment that courts could still handle.
Okay.
If you had wanted.
All right, thanks. Reverend Jackson was asking, is there a difference between Obeah and revivalism? I'm searching for what Anna asks in the meantime. Could someone answer that? Is there a difference between Obeah, Reverend Marvia? Is there a difference between Obeah and revivalism? That's a question from your part.
I would say there is a difference. You see, what happened is that revivalism, from my research, we can locate that as being so named. As I said, having come out of that 1860, 1861 Great Revival or the Great Awakening, depending on, as I said, whether you're coming from the American source or just how it is labeled locally. So the Great Awakening or the Great Revival saw this outbreak of Christian fervor, zeal and passion and so on. And it wasn't just here. So out of that would emerge what we have as the revivalists and revival Zion. The thing then is, one of the challenges, as you heard Mr. Taylor talking about Obeah, is that it's a set of beliefs and practices that can be found, although it is identified specifically with Africans and African religious expressions and so on. You can find those practices in other religious spaces as well. So the revivalists do have, and some of them do have in their practices, their ritual practices, some of these things. But many revivalists will tell you that they do not, because again, remember the distinction I created between the 1860 and the 1861. One set is said to be the good set, the Christian set, and the other is said to be those who are practitioners of Obeah. So it's you have to go back now to figure out, where do you fall? What's your roots? Where do you come from? And trace that down. So for me, I see a difference between the revivalists, revival Zion, and those who don't have any connection, because the revivalists and revival Zion also have churches and follow liturgy similar to the Christian church, although they may employ more music, more dancing, and so on. So that's what I would say in terms of seeing the distinction.
There are many questions. There are many questions.
If I mean,
there are many questions. Just hold
the way how the Obeah Act is drawn, it speaks about persons pretending either to possess some kind of supernatural power. It is quite possible, since Obeah is not defined. You are running your religious meeting. You are saying, come here for healing. And you go and you have your hands on people's head and you're slaying them in the spirit and saying, be healed. Well, let's say that an enthusiastic graduate from the National Police College is in that service. Why shouldn't he arrest you for pretending to possess any supernatural power? Is it because it's within the Christian belief? Well, I don't know how you could declare that, because Obeah is not defined. Obeah is not defined to say it is purely African. So let us even go worse, Marvia, because it says for gain or for fraudulent intent. Suppose I go and I say, claim that I heal you and I anoint you and so on, and I am still sick at the end of it. Could I not go to the police and have you charged under the Obeah Act?
You could. Except that
it's a Christian service.
Mr. Taylor, the only exception is what I stated before. The established church has the history of respect,
and that is what is protecting them.
And the respect and belief that what is done in that space, it's okay. It's not fraudulent. No matter how many apostles and bishops went to raise the dead and heal, etc., they will not be charged, because again, they fall under the banner of the established church that has been authorized to deploy such powers and make such claims. And however, if you fall under the banner of the little Obeah man or Obeah woman, you're going straight to jail or be charged or at least investigated.
And I agree with you until the day you get an atheist policeman who decides, say, you know what, the whole law of practicing magic. And he decides to arrest and charge you all. This is one reason why this act needs to be repealed.
One second.
Dr. Dick, you were going to say something.
Yeah, you have quite a few questions. I'm just trying to get through them. The point has been made quite clearly a while ago. From Moya Thomas, could Jeremy speak a little more about how the repeal of the Vagrancy Act effectively legalized witchcraft and palm reading, etc.? And could he also speak about whether the Vagrancy Act and the Obeah Act overlapped? And I'm going to ask Anna if you could just rewrite your question, because I'm trying to search, but there are so many. And just Needham, just to write your comment and I'll read it. Could you take that in the meantime while I do some other search?
The Vagrancy Act and the Obeah Act did overlap. So while the Obeah Act was geared towards the practice of those African traditions of, well, in relation to the supernatural, the Vagrancy Act tried to catch others. So the repeal of the Vagrancy Act has actually caused some problems in Jamaica. It has put prostitution into a legalized gray area right now in Jamaica, because this was the act under which prostitution was criminalized. Its repeal has meant that prostitution kind of operates within a semi-legal space. So what the Vagrancy Act criminalized, it criminalized the other aspects of the supernatural practice. So European supernatural practices, East Indian supernatural practices were once caught under the Vagrancy Act. So all of these gypsies, fortune tellers, Madame Rusakova went to come and read tarot cards and tell you for up to 1993, that was illegal. It was a criminal act. But when the Vagrancy Act was repealed, and it specifically speaks about fortune telling and so on, it allowed these practitioners to have a legal space to operate, which is why I say the Indian astrologers can operate legally. But because Obeah, I can't really say that Obeah is of East Indian origin or so on, but it allows them to operate legally. But the man who is practicing some African thing, who you go to read up your fortune, police can arrest him and he can go to jail for 12 months, or the parish court judge can lay a fine on him for a couple $1 million.
Thank you.
That is the dichotomy in Jamaica at the moment.
Okay, thank you.
I think
Reverend
Dr. Perkins was asking
Reverend
about
Marvel.
where we are. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
I was just going to read it for you, and you can answer. Why are we afraid of the occult? As a people of faith, where is this coming from? So you take that, Reverend Marvel.
All right. So basically, in responding to the fear, I think it's a psychological thing. It's a psycho-spiritual thing where we are afraid of that which we do not know, we do not understand, and especially if that thing we have been taught is able to harm. That is a feature of the wisdom of community and the wisdom of society. That if something is said that it's going to hurt you, you are going to stay away from it. Is the fear unfounded, or is it real? I think in some cases, the fear is not unfounded. I think in some cases, it is the things that we do not understand. It doesn't mean that the thing isn't real. What we need to look at is what exactly is taking place and what they are doing and how they might be dangerous. So earlier on, we would have gotten examples of, is this, when Mr. Taylor was talking, he was saying, are these practices, how do people use the tools? How do they use, every tool can be weaponized. Let me put it that way. Every tool can be weaponized. And when we're talking about occult practices, we're talking about things like magic, the mystical arts, things that we believe have the power to influence, control, manipulate events, people, places, circumstances. That's what some people believe. And we say believe, kill, and believe, cure. There are those who put their faith in the power of these things to actually work, that they are sufficiently effective. And then there are those who challenge that, to say that that might not be the case in all circumstances. So what we're having now is a discussion that is so subjective. What works and what doesn't? How do you know that somebody really obey you? Chances are you might have gone to somebody else who tell us that somebody obey you, and likely your neighbor or somebody who you know, and that creates some animosity in the community. Otherwise, you could also have scenarios where individuals say that they have been obeyed, and psychologically for their entire lives, they never ever rise to achieve anything because they're not going to try. They've been obeyed and they can't do anything, so it renders them paralyzed. So the power of faith in this is that, one, since you don't know, be careful, stay away from it. The stories like the Dealerance, for example, and Mr. Brown coffin that was circulating was so strong in our society, stones throwing on rooftop, etc. But if you do your research in the Dealerance, for example, or these Chicago ministries, you're going to find testimonies just as much as we get testimonies from the Christian space that these things are real. So it is so subjective that people are afraid, and many do not know what they're afraid of. And some are afraid based on things that they have experienced, but they might not necessarily be able to prove, just as though in spirit in Christianity, we can prove a lot of what we say we believe. That's faith.
I want to come to a point that you had raised, Reverend Dick, in your article when you wrote on the Obeah, because I've been looking at some of the questions in the chat. I think we need to make it clear. Nobody is saying that if your belief system does not allow you to embrace Obeah, that you must. My question is, you can still be a good Christian, you can still reject Obeah. My view is, why is it a criminal offense? Why are you punishing people who believe differently from you? If you realize that Jamaica is a plural country, it allows for many views to contend. The Constitution is written in such a way that it forbids the discrimination against any group. For example, let me reverse it. Let us say we lived in a country in which the official religion was Jeremyism. All right, was Jeremyism. And everybody went and worshipped at the Jeremyist church. And let us say that you are a bunch of Christians here. And let us say that Jeremyism teaches that communion is some kind of cannibalism based on your beliefs. Let us say that the resurrection is some kind of necromancy, you're raising the dead. Would it be wrong for the Jeremists to persecute the Christians? Would it be wrong to have a Christian law, undefined as the way it is, in which these practices, in which baptism, let me say, some kind of unhygienic washing, could that law be correct? What if the people are saying, well, you know, it is there to protect against evil and these evil practices? People in other parts of the world would be raising money against religious persecution right now, if that was to happen. And in fact, this is what happens in other countries where Christianity is not the religion of the majority. And we pray for our brothers and sisters in these countries. And here it is that we have laws that are persecuting people of a different belief system. It cannot be right. It only shows that sometimes when Christians get a little power, they are ready. For those who are defending the keeping of the law, they are ready. They don't see nothing wrong with this kind of oppression.
All right, I'm going to ask for closing arguments now from our panelists. We'll start with the Reverend Marvia Laws, and then we'll have the closing argument from the Reverend, Mr. Jeremy Taylor, and then on the program it says that I must give closing remarks.
I want to make it very clear, sir, that I'm not advocating that anybody go out and start practicing Obeah. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying that because I'm Christian does not mean that I cannot argue for something to be fair and just and honest. And I'm also saying that as an African descendant, that I believe that there are a number of injustices that must be corrected. And a lot of those injustices are located in the religious space. Additionally, it is not my state or approach that every single thing that I seek to speak for must be, I must look for how Jesus is going to be glorified in that. And if that is the case, then I would say that Jesus would want us to be fair and just toward others, and that we should not try to force anybody to become as we are or worship as we are, but we should facilitate the same freedoms that we would like ourselves, as Mr. Taylor just said. And also, as we wrap up on this matter, I would want us to begin as a society to look back again at not just Obeah in and of itself, but look at a number of practices as it relates to religion that continue to enslave us mentally and to challenge us as a people to take that seriously and honestly as one of the ways that we're going to move forward as a people, liberated not only in our mind, but in our entire social order as well.
Thank you. Before you come in, Mr. Taylor, with your closing argument, I see the hand of Joe Williams, but I don't know how to get a response. I don't know if you have to write the question in. Could Joe Williams write that question?
Or perhaps Joe Williams can unmute his mic and say the question.
I get the impression as if some people are having problems with the unmute.
Oh, okay.
Yes, thank you. I am from over 70 years now. I have been trying to find out what is Obeah. And I just found out this evening. And my definition of Obeah is just a con man or woman who believe they can convince some vulnerable or unsuspecting person in believing that he or she can do something for them. Now, if you don't believe in a thing, it can't hurt you. That is my stance against Obeah. I'm not even interested in knowing what it is, because as far as I'm concerned, Obeah can do me nothing. And that is just what I want to say. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks very much. This is only one hand was up, right? Orville Beckford, hand is up too.
Yes.
Go ahead.
I missed the first part of the meeting, which I was sorry about, but I had a family issue dealing with. I want to ask how many people here have been to Obeah, man. I have been to many. I want to know how many people have been, and then to ask them, were they able to differentiate between the Obeah man and the faith healer? Because we throw the baby the bathwater as far as Christianity is concerned. As far as concerned, the word of Obeah man, but there are genuine faith healers. Because I started studying Obeah at the University of the West Indies for my PhD, and then stop and went and do something else. So by that time I visited about 40 Obeah men and women. Some were just faith healers. They were not meant no evil to no one, was doing evil to no one. What they're doing was helping people. Can the church at least have an open mind when they look at these things rather than think that the word of Obeah man and so should be shut down outside the city?
Thank you very much, Dr. Beckford. Is there anybody online? We'll take one last hand, Sister Maureen Cunningham. But is there anybody online who has been to the Obeah man and got a good result? And anybody who was Obeah'd and got a negative result? Just put it in the chat as we take Sister Maureen Cunningham. But if you have a good result, just write it in. And you have a bad experience when you went to the Obeah man, just write it in. Thank you for that observation, Reverend.
Thank you, Rev. Good evening, everyone. I sat here and I listened. The brother asked how many people have ever been. I've never been to an Obeah man, but I know about faith healing. My grandmother was a faith healer. She came out of the 61 revival. And she was put out of the Baptist church, and she could not go to any other church because she was a Baptist. And she set up her mission, and persons who believed that God could heal them went to her mission, and she prayed for them, and they were healed. And or they recovered. And it's not that they recovered and went back to their sicknesses. So the doctor, one of the medical doctors in Morant Bay, took her to court, or had an injunction taken out against her, stating that she was an Obeah practicing person, because people even took their sick relatives out of the hospital to be prayed for, a faith healer. And when she went to court, the judge threw out the case, because there was no evidence, she had no paraphernalia pertaining to the practice of Obeah. And I see where the revival church, some of the revival practicing people, they go to church in the morning, many of them are from the Baptist faith, and in the evening they go to to the Revival Church because they were not allowed to express themselves in the worship at the traditional churches. So they went in the evenings to practice as it came out of the slave rituals or the slave practices. And I just wanted to add this as I listened. I remember Simon Magus. He saw the apostles being used by God in miraculous ways. And he wanted to buy because he had been practicing and was not getting the results that the prophets got. And this is the same thing that I see happening with those who practice, say they practice Obeah. They try to copy the faith healers, but they charge a fee. And they tell their people that they can do things. When I was in Porus, when we were in Porus, there were places in Porus, barnyard. People from all over came to the barnyard to be healed and charge big fees to do things that they couldn't do, just like Simon Magus. So as Christians, we have to test the spirit and to know what is of God, and do not, as the brother said, throw out the baby and the bath water. God said, the scripture says, these signs shall follow those who believe. And if, Christians allow their faith to be extended, God can use us even now to do what those people used to do. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I should tell you that Sister Maureen Cunningham is from St. Thomas.
Very much so.
That shouldn't prejudice the importance of what he said. All right. We'll now have closing comments from Mr. Taylor. Germany,
you need to unmute his mic.
Unmute. And Dale, you have more questions?
Yeah, I want to say that I am glad at the turnout. Really hope we're going to see you at the George Lai lecture on the second Sunday in October. It's going to be on free villages. So we hope that this turnout and more are going to come out, and for any other Baptist forum. I want to reemphasize something I said. I am not against, persons can still maintain their conscientious views against Obeah. If you are a Christian, that is fine. If you're a Christian and you believe that Obeah is evil, that is fine. My point is, the law is an imperfect vehicle in dealing with this issue. All I am saying is, why should it be a criminal offense? Now, people are saying, yes, it works evil and so on. Well, that may be fine. The law of evidence really does not allow me to be able to prove that evil works. For example, if you are claiming that Obeah caused the murder of somebody, how do I prove that in court? But yet you have a criminal statute which is saying, which doesn't define it, but is saying that I must go ahead and do so. The law is an imperfect vehicle for venturing into realms which are moral and spiritual. Obeah is evil. Your faith in God should be able to protect against it. I begin with the question that I asked. I end with the question that I asked at the beginning. Notwithstanding your beliefs about Obeah, is this a law that should continue to be retained? My view is the same as the former Justice Minister's view. It is a law that has outlived its useful purpose. In fact, did not have a useful purpose to begin with. So that is my view.
I think we can say, based on the presentations by our two panelists, that argument done. They have argued very convincingly about the root, the unjust root of the law and unjust continuation of the law. Perhaps it might be useful to sum it up this way. that there are historians, some scholars, including Monica Schuler, Clinton Houghton, I think Mervyn Alleyne, who have written saying that being a Native Baptist and a Mile-ist is one and the same thing. So in that classification, under the Obeah Act, all Native Baptists are Obeah workers, Obeah people. And there is, people don't realize that there's a connection between Native Baptists and what we now call the Jamaica Baptist Union. So it would put us in a very difficult position. And as has been said by other speakers, based on the act, some of the practices that happen in churches, overzealous police or atheist police could bring a charge against persons. And as Sister Cunningham said, it was done. And somebody mentioned that the case went before Justice Vanderpump in St. Thomas. So this is not a hypothetical thing. And as Jeremy had said, that in parts of the world, there are Christians who are persecuted for their beliefs and their belief system. And perhaps it might be sobering to remember that under the slave society, being a Baptist was seen as a superstitious belief. And persons, including George Lyle, was prosecuted and jailed for sedition. So we who have experienced discrimination under the law, we who have experienced persecution, imprisonment under the law because of our Christian beliefs or Baptist beliefs, now that we are in the majority, we cannot turn around and support criminalizing somebody else's belief, which we don't agree with, which we don't believe in, which we don't believe can even harm us or bring us any success. We are confident in our own, the power of God, as the apostles were, who dismissed those who were workers of witchcraft. And so it is not, my understanding of the panelists, it's not that they are not endorsing Obeah. They have no experience, practical experience in Obeah. All they are saying is that those who have different beliefs from us, including those who are practicing Obeah, should not be criminalized. And going further, that both of them have agreed that the Obeah Act as is poorly defined, vague, serves no useful purpose, and can be used to abuse others. And so in Christian love, where we love one another, we love our neighbor as ourselves, we would want all to be treated equally. Would like to thank you all for participating. Almost 500 on the Zoom, not to mention the YouTube. Some of you have asked for part 2. We'll have to hand it over to the committee led by our chairman, Jeremy Taylor. Some of you have suggested other topics. African spirituality, again, we'll hand over. This is being recorded, so we'll hand over these things to the committee to look at. And we really want to say thanks for all of you and your comments and your insights. Want to say a special thanks to Kimmy Lee, who did some background work, to Delia, moderator of the chat room, and especially our esteemed and those who did the panelists, Reverend Maria Laws and Mr. Jeremy Taylor QC, for the work they did, the presentation they made. We thought it was powerful and profound and practical. And we plan and we pledge that we will work towards what they have suggested. Thank you. Thank you. Good evening, all. All right.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator, for moderating this. So,
pleasure was all mine. Very informative. And if you want a copy of the presentation, just let us know and we'll send you the PowerPoint presentation.
Yes, Kim Lee, who works at the Jamaica Baptist Union, has them in soft copy, so it's a matter of reaching out.
All right. Good night and God bless. Thanks to all of you for coming.